Okay guys, in this particular lesson what we're going to be focusing on is a basic overview of cells. So one of the first things that we're really going to focus on is the idea of what a cell is. And this first point should really be pretty reviewed to you, pretty simple. The idea that a cell is the basic unit of life, and we should know that that one single cell is capable of all the various life functions. So the idea that one cell alone, such as particularly a bacteria cell, that bacteria cell can do everything on its own that your whole entire body can do. The idea that it's capable of all of the life functions. It's going to be able to reproduce on its own. It's going to be able to obtain energy. It's going to be able to grow and develop. It's going to be able to do all these things on its own while your entire multicellular body needs all of those separate cells functioning together in order to perform these functions. In addition, the fact that the idea that the human body is 50 to 100 trillion cells. It's a whole lot of cells, guys, that have to be functioning and working together in order for you to function and work properly. All of these different cells have substantial similarities. We should know that because we should know that they all have similar organelles, right? That's something that we talked about in biology last year. So the idea that all these different cells have similar organelles. However, they're going to vary in size, shape, and function. We should know that a blood cell versus a nerve cell versus a skin cell are all going to be slightly different in the way that they appear, their size, their shape, and they're going to be significantly different in their function. So, first thing we're going to talk about is something that's referred to as the composite cell. And what this really is talking about is a typical general cell. This is what we talk about in biology. So, this is what we cover in bio. We cover a composite cell. We cover a basic general overview. The idea that all cells have a nucleus. The idea that all cells have smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulum. All cells have mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, ribosomes. That they all have this exact same structure when the reality is that they don't. They're all very different despite their similarities. So that composite cell, that basic generalization, is going to help you to understand each of those specialized cells in their own way. Which leads us to cell differentiation, which is the idea of specializing for function for a cell. So the idea that they all kind of start out similarly, but as they develop, they're going to have specific jobs. And as they develop, they're going to develop with that specific job in mind, and their structure is going to be related to the function. Remember, relating that anatomy to physiology, that they go hand in hand together. So a nerve cell's structure is going to be directly linked to its function of being needed to carry nerve impulses. So a muscle cell's structure is going to be based on contraction, while, like I said, a nerve cell capable of carrying a signal. So they're going to be substantially different in their size and shape due to that differentiation. Right here we're looking at an egg cell versus a muscle cell versus a red blood cell versus a white blood cell. Kind of giving you guys an idea as to what all of these different cells, size, shape really is about. So when we look at cell structures, we can really divide them up into three main parts, and this is slightly different from what you guys learn in biology. When we divide up cell structures, we indicate that the nucleus, cytoplasm, and the cell membrane are the three big parts, or three big sections of a cell. So when we talk about the cell membrane to begin with, we should know that the cell membrane is lipids, proteins, and some carbohydrates all kind of intertwined together to create the cell membrane that encompasses the entire cell. All right, it's thin, it's flexible, it's elastic. The word we use is that it's fluid. It bends, all right? You're able to have a cell that dimples in some areas, all right, versus a cell that's going to be it's not rigid, all right? Pressure in one area is going to allow that cell to kind of just dimple in, and it's not going to actually like rupture the whole entire cell, right? Fluidity. It's also referred to as the phospholipid bilayer. So if we really look at that word and we break it down, we've got phospholipid, bi, meaning two, layers, right? what should come to mind to you guys is something that looks a little similar to this. Please bear with me with my horrible drawing on my tablet. All right, that phospholipid bilayer, these like little circles with two little legs sticking out of it. And when I refer to these polar heads, right, by polar heads, what I'm really talking about is that phosphate group, right? So by polar heads, I'm talking about that phospho component of the phospholipid bilayer, the phosphate groups. In addition, the polar heads are going to be water soluble. And the word that we use for that is that they're hydrophilic. They like water. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because this whole phospholipid bilayer, right, these two separate layers, are what are really going to encompass the whole entire cell itself, right? And everything inside of this cell is going to be a liquid component, and everything outside of this cell is going to be a liquid water-based component. So you're going to want those phosphate heads, those polar heads, to be hydrophilic because they're constantly going to be in contact with water. Meanwhile, the nonpolar tails are going to be the fatty acid component. And that fatty acid component, what should come to mind is the fact that fatty acids are a main structural component of lipids. So that fatty acid lipid component, well, we know that lipids shouldn't really mix very well with water. They are water insoluble, which makes sense. Oil and water, they don't mix, right? So these fatty acid tails are kind of going to not want to be near the water. So we call them hydrophobic. Which makes sense because in this whole space in here, that middle space between our bilayer, we're not going to have any water because those nonpolar tails, those fatty acid tails, are going to repel the water either outside of the cell or into the cell and force it to one of those two sides, not allowing it to remain in between the two layers. Just another picture showing us that cell membrane. So looking at it from a distance versus up close, we can see here we have our phosphate heads and our two fatty acid tails. When we talk about the function of the cell membrane, we should know that it maintains the integrity of the cell, right? What we're talking about there is shape. It kind of gives the cell some definitive shape, even if it's not rigid. Selectively permeable is the description that we use about the cell membrane related to its function. And that's the idea that it controls the entrance and exit of substances. And if you'll remember, last year I often referred to the cell membrane as the bouncer, right? The bouncer of club cell, right? Because it's controlling the entrance and the exit of the substances, and it's kind of deciding who does and does not get to come in. And it's also a part of signal transduction, and that's the idea that certain messages are going to be relayed to the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is going to relay them in response into the cell in order for cellular functioning to occur. So that membrane transport, right, the idea that substances are going to be able to pass through, which we're going to discuss in substantially more depth in a later section, but that phospholipid component, the idea that lipid soluble molecules are going to be able to pass through, things that are going to mix well with lipids because of that fatty acid portion, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroids, they're going to easily pass in and out. But those water-soluble molecules, the molecules that are going to be dissolved into the water and mixed into the water, they're not going to be able to pass because water's not really going to be able to pass easily through the cell membrane, right? Those are amino acids, sugars, proteins, some of the ions. They're going to need a completely different mode of transport across the cell membrane. The cholesterol component of the cell membrane is going to kind of add to that water insolubility. Cholesterol is going to be embedded in certain spots within the cell membrane. Right, so it's going to be a structural piece of the cell membrane in some areas. And since cholesterol is a lipid, obviously water insolubility is going to kind of be emphasized It's also a bit more rigid, which kind of adds to the structure and stability and can kind of link us back to that having a definitive shape, or at least a somewhat definitive shape and integrity of the cell. So cholesterol is really just kind of re-emphasizing some of those ideas. In addition, for the cell membrane, there are proteins that are going to be also embedded throughout the cell membrane, and these proteins serve a wide range of functions. Receptor proteins, integral proteins, enzymes, right? Some of the things that should come to mind for you is the idea of channels, right? The idea of pumps, right? Some of these things should be relatively ringing a bell from biology class, and we're going to, like I said, talk about them a bit more in depth later. But these proteins have many different reasons or many different jobs when it comes to the cell membrane. This table for us is really just indicating what our specific functions are for those particular protein types. So the idea that receptor proteins are going to help with that message transmission, while integral proteins are going to help form pores, channels, right? That's that like ion channel business. Enzymes, again, about the signals. Cellular adhesion molecules, which we refer to as CAMs, C-A-M-S, they're going to help cells stick to each other, which we'll talk a bit more about. Surface proteins, which are kind of used in identifying the cells that actually are part of your body. All these different proteins have various functions, right? This is just showing you kind of a structural picture of the cell membrane. So as you see, we have that phospholipid bilayer, but all the while we have various things that are kind of embedded. Here we have a protein that's kind of spanning the entire phospholipid bilayer. We have some of those carbohydrate molecules that are kind of here. We have cholesterol molecules that are kind of in certain areas of the cell membrane. We have some other types of proteins, and you can see those carbohydrates are kind of linked to those proteins. So the cell membrane is really more complex than just a phospholipid bilayer.